Welcome to this, the second instalment on philosophical investigations into the Russo-Ukrainian War. Ukraine's history has been a story of a series of territorial, political, religious and imperial clashes, and the thwarting of early attempts to define a singular nationality, a country in other words, in the face of invasion or protracted predatory warfare. As a geographical region in recent history, Ukraine has experienced some of the worst violence of the major European conflicts of the 20th century, and it has been subjugated and violated in the name of totalitarian communism and suffered a genocidal campaign against its people in the 1930s, known as the Holodomor, and the country has continued to be abused and exploited from the outside as well as from the inside, as its national politicians sought to determine the country's international status and a sense of identity going back to 1991, while various power blocs, foreign, globalist and domestic, sought to control the potential wealth of this newly emerging democracy. Ukraine's modern history is tragic, and yet its people continue to uphold and give voice to their sense of identity. An identity, like that of many cultures, stretches back many centuries, and which was given an impetus in the rise of nationalism across Europe in the 19th century by key intellectuals, and which also found a new voice at the end of the 20th century in a world of hope set against a turbulent background in the guise of shifts in the balances of power and incipient international terrorism. While the outsider can readily appreciate the heroism of its defenders in the face of Russian aggression, the philosopher and the historian must withdraw from personal connections or current media ploys and distractions to review the event and indeed the ongoing phenomena with a sense of objectivity, and then to try to express what that means, so we can all gain a better sense of the reasons surrounding the war. And so doing, we may also gain a sense of the philosophical and moral compass by which we can evaluate what has been going on, given what we know. The vicissitudes of the various peoples who have inhabited the general Ukrainian area reflect the tumultuous past of many peoples around the world. But what has attracted our attention in the past year of 2022 has been what seems like a heinous treachery committed by the Russian government against a people whose fledgling nation is just over 30 years old. However, we simultaneously need to recognise and keep reminding ourselves that war always unleashes a Pandora's box. War permits the murderers, the insane, the narcissists who believe they have the plan for everybody else in the country, the fantasists who make history and the present into something they're not, the egotists who believe that they are the best leaders or generals. All such people are motivated by slippery beliefs or evil agendas, and generally by what we call a lack of integrity. For in their extremism or narrow review of reality and history, there is no alignment to truth and justice, never mind love and forgiveness, no desire to see another point of view except their own, whatever flag they wave. Their preference is ultimately for force and violence, because it suits or appears to suit their interests, or those of their masters. On the other side, there are the principled, the heroic, the stoic, the brave and the courageous defenders of life and liberty who are thrust centre stage into a madness not of their choosing. The heroic may sometimes be sought out by the media to provide a story, but most professional soldiers and auxiliaries just want to get on with doing their job to the best of their abilities. The media stories also act to distract from the realities of most of the people on all sides caught up in a war, or they pick up the noisome extremists who have something to say, as it were, or those who propel themselves centre stage as the main protagonist in a drama for some agenda that the journalists are also peddling, such as look how evil or naive or repressed all Russians are, or look how all Ukrainians joined to defend their homeland are fascists and Nazi supporters. Such narratives may constitute a form of journalism, but one must wonder what the purpose of such journalism is, especially when it has all the hallmarks of propaganda, or what philosophers call sophistry. In the current fashion for deriding fake news, we need to be aware and mindful of who is calling out the fake news and what their agenda is. Too often counterfactual or controversial opinions are being cancelled in the modern vernacular or ignored without too much consideration as to critical analysis. The noise of war is thus not the reality of war. War is in so many respects a failure of philosophy. That is, a failure of human wisdom as it seeks understanding and connection with the self, others, and the world. Historically, so much war is excused for on grounds that are not universally moral or accepted. For instance, territorial expansion. Why is that necessary when people can trade? Or imposition of a certain religion or political doctrine. Why is that needed when the apparent ignorant can be engaged in discussion? Or defence of the honour of the nation or the elite interpreting personal slights as reflecting that national honour? And why must we bow and fight for a peculiar interpretation of honour, and yet not for the honour of civility and peace? Now, there is a case for what we can call a just war. Typically, a just war is one that is committed to in self-defence, but also as a war that upholds and defends peace, in which the honourable and the good seek to relieve the suffering of the innocent and uphold rationality and civility, and in which the gods may encourage the wise to take their quiet refuges to avoid the destruction that war entails as warriors and soldiers fight, so they may be available to help a country return to a civilized mentality and also to keep their armies on a morally just path. Yet too often an aggressive war is expressed in the words and themes of the justifiable by deploying rightful and honourable concepts, such words as peace, security, freedom, which are only to be unmasked by critical philosophical reflection, or more often than not by the evidence that we witness of desperate deeds done dastardly. But the actual breaching of civility's barriers, on the firing of weapons, on the part of either side in a war, acts like a cultural and psychological incendiary that stokes and fires up the evil lying in the hearts of evil men and women, who project their personal anger, their frustration, their victimhood, their irresponsibility, despair, their craving and condemning resentment outward through political action or political demagoguery. And once the dogs of war are unleashed, the field presents its own apparent justification of all that is destructive and self-destructive within people who come to the fore. They believe they have a permission to be as destructive and evil as they wish. Thought and reflection diminish at the commencement of war. Lord Grey, at the beginning of the First World War, is quoted as saying that the lights of Europe or civilization are going out in our lifetime, and we shall never see them lit again. The chronic biological stress that is also released, the adrenaline response, collectively, literally cuts the brain's ability to think clearly. The collective runs the risk of collapsing into a stressed modality of fear and also despondency, and the philosophically awake may throw their energies and talents into protecting the weak and the vulnerable. War is no time to meditate on the nature of existence and the deeper subtle concerns of the human condition. It is a time to act with courage, in whatever manner or mode offers itself, to keep to the honourable and professional side of life, and as Rudyard Kipling reminds us, to keep our heads when all around are losing theirs, to serve the higher virtues of hope, love, mercy, trust and wisdom, and to do so courageously. As the novelist and journalist G.K. Chesterton aptly puts it, a true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him. But one of the biggest issues that our modern world, and particularly the West, is currently undergoing is what I can only call a systemic philosophical illness, a sickness, a reduction in the application of mind to the world's problems, in what is effectively a systematic assault on critical thinking, which is often done in the name of some critical something or other, thereby using the words of mind, reason, science to undermine the mind, that is philosophy, science and rationality, and never mind the higher values of love, forgiveness, toleration and happiness. Hence, we are currently witnessing a creeping civility, a slave mentality that various forms of authoritarianism around the world are exploiting, and they will always seek to exploit unless we counter them. We've been here before. During the Middle Ages, in which the academically intelligent in our universities fell, well, according to the critics, fell into increasingly specific esoteric pursuits, arguing about the number of angels on pinheads, in which they actually forsake their humanity for the sake of seeking the intangible. And they lose all connection with the grander context, as the Emperor Nero apparently did while Rome burned. In that respect, one of my personal motives for reading up on Ukrainian history and reviewing the problems of the current war is partly that the war has threatened the stability of international relations and threatens an escalation that will affect life for all of us, and also because it symbolises a complete reversal of the true liberal political values of toleration, pluralism, and representative, accountable and open government, values that we all thought were understood as self-evident after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War in 1990-91. After all, this was a period in which there was a sense that militarism was dead, and that we could all get along in peace and harmony, and that nations would respect each other's territories and sovereignty. Yet now, in 2022-23, we see that the belief that war is a means to solving disputes as a legitimate process has been gaining momentum and is on the verge of ensnaring our minds. The attacks on our liberties, and hence self-worth, accelerated by the fear-mongering policies unleashed by a so-called global war on a virus, are now becoming acceptable and commonplace. They are rarely challenged. The compliance that was tested in the COVID lockdowns has seemingly persisted, with a lack of critical journalism in the mainstream media, married to international policies to support Ukraine with funds and military hardware, at least, without any critical thought. Or the censorship of Russian voices by Western media and governments, which does not bode well for critical thinking and openness and honesty, which require permitting the citizenry access to research all but the most military classified information. It should not involve banning access to Russian media or opinions, such as their equivalent to the BBC, that is RT.com, as they've done in the UK, in Germany, Poland, other parts of the European Union and Australia, and on various big tech platforms. In denying citizens access to alternative viewpoints, Western governments are dangerously, and perhaps are doing so on purpose, leaning into totalitarianism. George Orwell spoke clearly of this dystopia in his book 1984. We then fall into a worldview in which force, violence and war are the means of enforcing political agendas on others. And so rationality, reason, integrity, toleration, love, reference to universal principles of self-determination, sovereignty, dignity and freedom are rejected or ignored by those who seek to impose their will upon others or use whatever means they believe necessary without any reference to the higher values that underpin and secure our civilization. The word necessary can be twisted into anything untoward and even downright evil. The struggles that have beset Ukraine since 2014 are acting almost as an experiment between various and nefarious political forces and interests to see how far they can go. The innocents in the meantime are paying a heavy price for that experiment. Freedoms and dignities are pummeled by military expediency. National and personal self-determination and sovereignty are violated by political excuses of one side or the other to assert an agenda that is quite removed from the desires of ordinary people to just go about their lives. So while the initiation of aggression against a sovereign territory by Russia in 2022 was something that was an egregious breach of universal morality, integrity, and the particulars that are expressed in international law and the Just War Conventions, there is always a wider, greater context, more detail and depth for us to examine and evaluate. And that greater context may also lead us to consider the West's own actions and to remind us that not all that is done in the name of saving Ukraine from Russian aggression is integrous, that is morally principled. If this war escalates, it is because Western leaders have succumbed to the glamour of violence, the seductiveness of deploying high-tech equipment, of the apparent safety of a proxy war in which Western governments intervene and support Ukraine, far from the devastation and death being dealt daily. And so we may even recall the alluring archetype of the soldier adorned in uniform that's so symbolic of professionalism, courage and honour in manner and demeanour, yet which is also symbolic of untrammelled terror. The professional soldier does their duty by their country, but the militarist rejects the respecting of their professional martial values, which in the best of them do reflect the deep-seated values that they know are worth protecting and which we know are worth protecting. And instead the militarist sees the mass of the armed forces and materiel as resources to be moved around on digital maps, to be sacrificed for values that are antithetical, opposite to the soldier's understanding of war, or for hidden agendas. It is a common ploy in warfare. As a quick analogy, the outpouring of condemnation against Russia in the West is reminiscent of the guilt poured on Germany in 1918 by the victorious Allies at the end of the Great War at Versailles. Germany was deemed 100% guilty, and no culpability, guilt, was placed on the Allied powers and their treaties and alliances that intensified the military threat to a vulnerable Germany, whose Kaiser was stoking militaristic fantasies. The current Western universal media condemnation, the propaganda, and the popularised commentaries of hacks and twits around the world, enforced by the circus of virtue signalling which is currently alive in the West, and was so during and after the First World War, also disturbingly reminds us of Queen Gertrude's response in Shakespeare's Hamlet: "The lady doth protest too much, methinks." Truth sets us free. So the philosopher's response to the Ukraine war is to clear the nonsense, to be mindful of the repeated phrasing that hints at a lack of thought, and to challenge the presumptuousness of militarism, that military means are the only means by which to solve political problems. The philosopher's job is also to remind us not to remain in the depths of moral depravity and despair, or to allow ourselves to be enticed into further ethical degeneration in the use of total or nuclear warfare, but to keep the sights of our conscience on the higher values that support and reflect civility by choosing peace over war, negotiation over destruction. In the third video, we shall continue this philosophical investigation by reviewing the history and the political forces that have shaped and which are continually shaping Ukraine. Thank you for listening. I'm Dr. Alex Mosley.